Hello everyone, this is your host, Professor Reha, here with the class examination of the Apostate, which is the Inquisitor-Necromancer combination. Now this was another request by Brent Solrin, thank you for the request. And again, this is intended to do a broad overview of some of the more common broad builds of this class, in case you don't have the items, you want to improv this, or if you're just experimenting with the class and are trying to figure out where you want to take your own build in future. We will be covering the items for this combination in a future video. Now, as for the actual broad purposes of the Apostate, there is quite the conflict here. The Inquisitor, in a lot of ways, acts like the Nightblade, where it's very much skill and weapon focused and doesn't really care about pets. There is no real pet interaction here. By and large, now, there is the Word of Renewal, which in fact does boost allies nearby, which is fairly interesting, and can boost your pets, but beyond this, and potentially Inquisitor Seal, you're really not necessarily going to have a lot of interaction with pets, but it is possible. With that being said, there are three broad ways of playing the Apostate, and none of them have to do with necessarily a specific damage type, but what you're basically looking at is a pet-focused Apostate, a auto-attack focused Apostate, or a skill-based Apostate. And each one of these kind of... Well, the skill-based Apostate you can do a couple of different things with. There are the ways that it really works well and ways that you kind of need items for, but the rest of them are fairly linear. We're going to actually tackle the lesser talked about versions here, which would be, first off, the Pet Apostate, which, of course, again, as I stated, Inquisitor isn't one of the masteries that immediately comes to mind when you think pets, so not a lot of people talk about this, but there's actually some decent potential here. Now, if you're going to run a Pet Apostate, you really have two different unusual options for running this. Your first and foremost, and the most obvious, would be your Skeletons, your Master of Death, your Blight Fiends potentially. This isn't strictly required. I usually run them because Master of Death does increase poison and acid damage, so usually I will run the Blight Fiend, and then at this point you've got a couple of different options, because obviously this isn't going to pull all of your skill points, that's fairly obvious. What this comes down to is whether or not you want to be a ranged pet master, I guess you could say, or a melee one. If you're going to run melee, you're going to lean a little bit more heavily on two-handed melee, because Harvester of Death does cold damage, and you can take advantage of that in different ways. Run all the way up to Soul Harvest, great. That's one thing you can do, which is pretty effective, but it's by no means your only option. You've also got as options Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath. This really helps out the physical and vitality damage of your Skeletons, but you don't really do a whole lot of Aether damage. Even if you're running Bone Harvest, you'll notice that there's no actual Aether damage even on Soul Harvest here, so that becomes a little bit of a problem. I don't often build Spectral Wrath here. Sometimes I do if I have the right kind of weapon. If I'm using, you know, a two-handed melee weapon and it happens to do some Aether damage, then yeah, I'll put in Spectral Wrath if I have the points for it. But with the pet focus, I don't often use it. It's just worth mentioning as something that you can use that could potentially be effective. Again, it's going to depend a little bit on your itemization. And again, this is also kind of assuming you're going melee. This is a little less effective with ranged because you're not hitting enemies with the aura around you necessarily. From Spectral Wrath, it's just not going to be doing that. You'll still do the strike, but the aura part with the resistances isn't going to affect enemies at all. So that's a little bit of a problem, and either way, I don't often build this, but if you're melee, you can get some use out of this if you build correctly. For example, if you decide to go Drain Essence as a backup skill, then this becomes really useful. If you decide to go into Ravenous Earth as a backup skill, especially if you go to Foul Eruption, this can be fairly effective. If you decide to use Seer Souls for Siphon Souls, then this can be very effective. But a lot of the time, I'm going to be really honest, I don't really utilize Spectral Wrath that often. It's just not something I frequently go to. I will often go to Bone Harvest because I love this with pets. Beyond that, from the Inquisitor standpoint, if you're melee, Inquisitor Seal with Arcane Empowerment can be really useful. This is actually useful either way because you can chill in the back with your crossbowmen and your mages, and you can boost them through this. And in some ways, this is probably better if you're ranged because your crossbowmen do pierce damage where your melee skeletons aren't going to. Your mage skeletons will be doing elemental damage, or more elemental damage anyways. So this is probably a little better if you're ranged, but even if you're melee, this can pull a lot of weight. This can do a lot of effective damage. And kind of a similar thing here with Word of Renewal. The real problem with Word of Renewal with a ranged setup here, with a ranged Petmaster Apostate, primarily, is that you're not necessarily going to heal your frontline, which is the skeletons that will be taking the brunt of the damage, and you also won't be able to heal your Blight Fiend if you have one, who will, with his increased threat from Rotting Fumes and Blight Burst, is generally going to be tanking absolutely large quantities of the melee damage at the very least, because that's kind of what he's designed for. So if you're using Word of Renewal on a ranged Apostate using pets, you run the very distinct risk of not being in distance to heal your frontline. So if I am ranged, even if I'll probably still build Word of Renewal, I'll very likely kind of plant myself halfway between my melee and my backline skeletons, and then that way I'm more likely to heal my frontline and any damaged backline that I might have because enemies either came up behind, or maybe the enemy has a big AoE, who knows. Either way, it's a pretty good idea to not necessarily restrict yourself to as far back as you can. Try to plant yourself midway between your front and back line skeletons when you are doing a ranged apostate, so that way you can actually heal everyone who needs it most of the time. There will be moments where they'll kill an enemy and go running off after some more distant enemy just as you're about to heal and you miss the heal. It happens occasionally. I mean, they are AI-controlled pets. You're not going to have a perfect fight every time. It's impossible. But a majority of the time, if you do put yourself between the two lines of skeletons, you should be able to heal everyone that needs it. If you are going with a ranged apostate and you want to run pets, obviously you're probably not going to be looking at Bone Harvest because this doesn't have the biggest range. Your regular attacks are going to be more longer ranged. So what I usually do is I'll run ranged expertise and very specifically chilling rounds, because with chilling rounds I can freeze the enemies and decrease the incoming damage of my skeletons, which bursting round doesn't really offer. That's just damage. Granted, it's nice that it has damage, that's great, but it doesn't really help your skeletons survive, and they're the ones keeping the enemy away from you as a ranged character. And then Storm Spread also is just damage. Again, very nice, but if you're going with a ranged apostate, you are trying to keep some kind of medium range between you and the target. So Storm Spread, unlike with, say, a lot of other builds that are perfectly willing to run up and melee enemies even with a ranged weapon, that isn't really going to help you here with Storm Spread, so I often don't build this here either. And at the very least, with chilling rounds, you have that freeze that you can really utilize, which is very helpful. If you decide not to go into maybe focusing on your autos and you really want to do skills with your pets, then I would recommend the Rune of Hagarad. Again, this goes back to the freeze. You just plant this down next to your skeletons, and most enemies will still be there because skeletons, you know, they're engaged in combat there. They're not really going to run around. You can just throw a couple of Runes of Hagarad, you know, and just have the enemy be frozen, which is really great. You know, they attack slower afterwards as well. You're reducing their defensive ability, which means your skeletons will be hitting more often. They'll be critting more often. It's a magical time. I don't often, even though I normally say Deadly Aim is always worth considering, when I'm going with a pet focus, this really isn't something that I'm looking at a lot of the time, because this is very specific to me, and I'd rather be investing in something that I can boost or otherwise help my skeletons a lot more with. It's also worth mentioning as well, if you have the points for it and you're melee, Horn of Gandar, again, your chain confusing, which gives you and your skeletons a lot of extra time to whack the enemy, reduce damage for those that aren't confused for long enough. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. I love the Horn of Gandar a lot, and if I'm not going with a full elemental build, I often play this because it's just fantastic. It's just amazing. And yeah, this is really something you are really going to want if you have the points for it. I mean, it really depends on what you're building. Again, if you have stuff that increases a lot of piercing damage, this is even more effective. But yeah, this is really something you'll want to be looking into. And if you're going with two-handed weapons, a two-handed ranged or a two-handed melee, that does even more, because this is pulling off your weapon damage. So if you're wielding a two-handed weapon, this is something that not a lot of people think about. If you're wielding a two-handed weapon, this hits even harder, which is always nice to see. You could also alternatively do Necrotic Edge as well, although I don't usually run this, especially with ranged. It's just not something I'm fond of doing. If you find yourself having a hard time healing, you could go into Reaping Strike for free heals, but that's entirely up to you. This works a little bit better if you are running Spectral Banding and Spectral Wrath, but for the most part, at the very least, if I'm going melee, I'm probably going into Bone Harvest a lot of the time, and if I'm going ranged, I'm probably going to go into Chilling Rounds a lot of the time. Maybe Rune of Hagrad if I have the points for it. And again, Horn of Gandar is always worth considering. But for pet focus, that's really what you're looking towards. You're not really going to be looking at a lot of other abilities. I mean, Rune of Calistor just does damage, which your skeletons are already doing, so it's not a huge deal. I'm just not that big of a fan of the Stormbox. It's good against bosses, I'll give you that. With the skeletons, with the pet build, it is very effective to slap this on a boss or a hero or somebody with a large amount of defense otherwise, because the decrease in defensive ability is going to help your skeletons punch through, is going to help your Blight Fiend punch through, and it can really help. And actually, a really fun thing you can do, which, I don't often do because I'm not the biggest fan of this, but it is fairly amusing to run Stormbox of Elgoloth and Lightning Tether. And while your skeletons and Blight Fiend are distracting the enemy, you Stormbox 2 or 3 enemies, and you just run around in a circle around the largest group of enemies and let the lightning tethers damage the enemy for you. It's not it's not efficient, I'll give you that, but it's a lot of fun. It's not the most effective way of doing things, but it's a blast to do. What you can also do if you're playing melee and you are in range of enemy ranged... That was a weird sentence going to be coming out of me. If you're in range of the enemy backline, you can in fact use Lightning Tether to your advantage by quite a large degree by using Stormbox on the enemy backline and then just positioning yourself so that way the enemy front line is between you and the backline, so you're damaging both. You're damaging the melee enemies with the tether, and you're damaging the ranged enemies with the actual Stormbox. And that can work out really well if you're a ranged pet user, although this will work even without pets. It's easier with pets, because the enemies, again, aren't necessarily going to be repositioning that as often because they've got the pets to deal with. So this does come in handy in that particular aspect, and I find this to be quite useful in that aspect. So do keep that in mind as an option. Now, your second method, really, instead of building Master of Death, you could instead choose to use Aura of Censure, which reduces enemy damage again, which helps your skeletons stay alive, but it drops the enemy elemental resistance, and your skeletons do a certain amount of elemental resistance. Specifically the mages, the melee enemies, the melee skeletons are still not doing necessarily elemental damage, but your mages will do more damage that way. I don't often do this. I think I've only done this once, and it was okay. I still prefer Master of Death, but it is something I have experimented with, and it did work. At the time, I didn't have a lot of dedicated equipment to that idea, so I'm sure it was an equipment issue, but I have tried this. It's okay. If you have the equipment to back this up, absolutely run it yourself, but it's just something that's at least worth considering if you aren't fond of Master of Death for whatever reason. So that's a pet apostate. It's a little bit restricted in its skills. You can splash out a little bit, really depending on what weapon you want to use. You do have to kind of cater yourself. Once you have your pet skills in there, your skeletons, your Master of Death, your Blight Fiend, what skills you accent those pets with really depends on whether or not you're going to be ranged or melee. So just kind of be aware of your positioning. It's very position specific, which is very unusual for pet builds, which a lot of the time don't necessarily care too much. I mean, the occultist is always going to have some mild concern about positioning because of the crow's healing. But beyond that, I mean, positioning isn't hyper important. Shaman pet builds tend to want to be melee so they can take advantage of their Briarthorn's aura, for instance. But in this particular case, you can be either frontline or range. It just depends on how you specifically want to approach this. So you do have a lot of interesting options in how you decide to enhance yourself, because you're never going to truly go 100% pets with an apostate. How you choose to enhance yourself is entirely up to you. And again, the Blight Fiend isn't necessary. It's really nice as a tank, but you don't need it to make an effective apostate pet build. You need the skeletons, obviously, because the skeletons, first of all, slap, and second of all, you can actually interact with that elemental damage that the skeleton mages are doing. Third off, you can heal the whole group of them if you position correctly. So you should at the very least have your skeletons. But how you want to play beyond that is really up to you. If you really want to dedicate yourself to it, the Blight Fiend and Master of Death, maybe you don't want to fully dedicate yourself, you run Aura of Censure, and you use Rune of Haggarad and Rune of Callistor, and you run Artifact Handling. You have a couple of different options. The runes, though, keep in mind, are a little bit more effective because you can use your skeletons as a way of keeping the enemy there and as kind of bait, and the enemy will stay in that position most of the time, and you can just slap down the rune and wait for it to pop, and you're pretty much golden. So it's a little easier to get runes to explode when you want them to with pets, with skeletons, so do keep that in mind. But now let's talk about the elemental side of things, because we have a couple of options here. Now, there are a couple of ways you can approach this. Generally speaking, when I'm approaching an elemental apostate, I usually will want to, well, not an elemental apostate specifically, but you've got the skill-based apostate, which can be elemental or non-elemental, and you've got the auto-attack apostate. I'll actually tackle the auto-attack apostate first, because it's a little more interesting in my opinion. So, running this, the auto-attack apostate, I would normally describe to you, oh yeah, you've got two options, it's gonna be glorious. No. Primarily, what you're gonna want to do, if you're not running pets, is you're going to want to use ranged attacks. I mean, you can do melee, it's a little bit tougher to pull off, in my opinion, because there's much less support for it. Obviously, the Inquisitor is focused on dual-wielding pistols, so there's just not as much support for a melee apostate if they're not using pets. But you can. But going into the ranged first, you can absolutely blast out all these kinds of elemental damage. Obviously, Word of Renewal, Grab, Reaping Strike, and Necrotic Edge. And then at this point, you run Inquisitor Seal, and then you've got the world's cheapest potential build. Now, again, how you actually specifically want to run this down is entirely up to you, because if you look at the point consumption here, it's not that high. Go over here, put points into Reaping Strike, put points into Necrotic Edge. Go ahead and max Word of Renewal, because we love to see all that healing. Alright? That's delightful. Then we go into Inquisitor Seal. And then we go into Arcane Empowerment. We've still got 30 points to play with. Now, whether or not you go into Aura of Censure or Aura of Conviction is entirely up to you. If you want to run a melee dual-wielding build, you can. If you want to do a ranged, non-melee build, I would recommend Aura of Conviction. It depends on how okay you are with getting into enemies' faces. But you can build Horn of Gandar, you can max either one of these, and you can put the rest of your points into Deadly Aim. You'll get this to 50%. You'll get to this to 50 points with 6. No. You'll get this to 50%, which is, fine. So, you have a lot of, and this is just basically something you're going to blast the horn, auto-attack, blast the horn, keep auto-attacking. You can use either... You don't necessarily have to dual-wield pistols. This is equally as effective with two-handed weapons, and in some ways actually could be more effective, because all three of these are going to be using the weapon damage, which is primarily pulling from your main weapon, as well as Reaping Strike and Necrotic Edge. And you don't have to necessarily use all of them. I'm just using this as kind of example. If you wanted to instead diversify with Flames of Ignifar, you could drop some of these. If you wanted to instead grab Spectral Binding, you can absolutely do that instead of these. But with this point, with these points here, you can actually pull all the way back to here, to the 15 points if you really wanted to, and then still absolutely... I'm just going to show you an example here. You can actually really do a lot of interesting things here with this. So we pull all the way back here. We max Spectral Binding. Let's pretend we're going to go with a melee dual-wielding pistol, because the idea, I just love it. We'll just go with Aura of Censure. Oh, look, we've got Deadly Aim here. Isn't that magical? And then, I don't know, maybe we use Ill Omen so we can clear out some space around us. Because we can. You know, you've got a lot of options here for the auto attack focus. Now, this is just generally how I approach this. Usually, you don't necessarily have to, but you do at least want to emphasize the elemental damage. I don't necessarily always build Reaping Strike. It's just extremely nice for emergency healing. But you have Word of Renewal, so it's not... Reaping Strike, I would say, out of all of these, is probably the least important one. But you can approach this either with a melee ranged view in mind, or the legitimately ranged view with the Aura of Conviction. It's pretty much your choice. But you can see where there's a lot of support for an auto attack focused build here. How you approach that beyond that, if you want to support that with some skills, absolutely go for it. I just tend to go big or go home. But you have all kinds of things you can do here. If you're melee, obviously you won't be pulling out the pistols here. If you're melee, what you're going to basically want to do is the Stormbox trick that I told you with the skeletons. That's very effective if you're melee. And then you just kind of just basically run that. You might want to use Siphon Souls with melee so that you have some more consistent healing if you really need that. So it really is up to you. But if you're going to use this, I do recommend ranged. I do recommend using ranged expertise in all of these at the very least, and probably Necrotic Edge as well. It's going to, again, be cold damage, which is increased by your elemental boost. Just a really nice time. And Spectral Wrath has the added benefit of reducing enemies' physical resistance, which is really nice because this means that your bursting round is doing more. Your guns, if they're doing physical damage, they'll be boosted as well. So that's really nice. That stacks really well with Steel Resolve, which is increasing physical damage. So it all can come together very nicely in that particular aspect. Besides this, though, you could also do a very interesting skill-based approach. Now, a skill-based approach can really come down to a couple of different ideas. One unusual combination that I don't see talked about a lot is the combination of Word of Pain, which gives you decreased Pierce Resistance, Aether Resistance, Chaos Resistance, Flames of Ignifar, specifically going into Tainted Flame, allowing us to use this Chaos Resistance drop. Right? We're not actually... Notice that we're not actually reducing elemental resistance here. It's the one damage type we're not reducing. We run this, right? Horn of Gandar, Aura of Censure, Spectral Binding as an option as well. Siphon Souls, whether or not you go into Seer Souls is up to you, or potentially, maybe you want to go Ravenous Earth, also an option. Maybe you want to go into Harbinger of Souls instead. Absolutely an option. I just really love the Endless Flame. You can absolutely do this, though, instead. Or maybe you don't want to do... See, the thing here is, with Death Sentence here, decreasing Pierce Resistance, Aether Resistance, Chaos Resistance, the idea basically is you throw out a Word of Pain, right? This lasts 8 seconds here, and then you're adding on all those decreased health regeneration, and then you're adding on another 4 seconds here. This is a 12-second duration. Decreases all the resistances by a large amount, right? Then we go into Flames of Ignifar. Alright. We're doing all this. I just really like Endless Flame so I can cast it for longer. Then we go into Horn of Gandar. Alright. Now, I usually run Aura of Censure, so that way I can reduce their elemental resistance. I usually will run this melee, obviously. Run Aura of Censure. And then at this point, you can basically run a whole bunch of different things. Spectral Binding, Spectral Wrath, I usually use because now, essentially, with this combination of skills, this is very unusual in builds, but with this particular combination, you are reducing enemy resistances to every damage type you are dealing. And this is a rare thing in Grim Dawn. Consider. Word of Pain. Elemental damage. Fire Cold. Then later on it gets some lightning. More Fire Cold. And it does straight elemental. Right? Now we're reducing elemental damage with Aura of Censure, which is stacking on a little bit of AoE fire damage. Right? Great. That's all of our elemental damage being boosted by the reduction of enemies' elemental resistance. Great. Magical. Now we have Flames of Ignifar. Now we could stick this to elemental, but now we're putting all of our eggs in one basket. And besides, we have Death Sentence, which is reducing enemy Aether and Chaos resistance. Alright, where can we get Chaos? Boom. Tainted Flame. Furthermore, this also increases the damage that this does by 15%, which is a fun time. But yeah, now we're splashing in some Chaos and Vitality damage. Alright, great. And that's a lot of Vitality and Chaos damage. Alright, now we're decreasing our Vitality and Chaos damage, but now we're doing Vitality damage, and Death Sentence doesn't decrease Vitality resistance. Ah, Spectral Wrath does, though. Vitality resistance down, more Aether resistance down, physical resistance down. By the way, Word of Pain, piercing resistance down. What does the Horn of Gandar do, pray tell? Piercing damage. Now you may be wondering, well, Professor, how are we going to stay alive? You're not healing. You're right, we're not healing. Not currently. But we can be. Now you've got a couple of options for healing. Alright? You can go into Siphon Souls. And if you are going to go into Siphon Souls, with this setup as it is, go into Seer Souls, convert that into Aether damage. You're reducing enemy Aether resistance by 50%. You're doing negative 25 here. You're doing negative 25 here. So if you are going to run Siphon Souls for the healing purposes, run Seer Souls. Because even though the total damage is modified by, or is decreased by 10%, that's not quite a big deal when the enemy's Aether resistance is dropping by 50%. You're even going to be slapping Ethereals moderately hard here, with certain rare exceptions. But this isn't your only healing option. You could go with the classic Word of Renewal. You could. Or, if you're feeling particularly spicy, you can run Siphon Souls and a Word of Renewal, which is fine, and put in a couple of points into Vigor. Not bad. Or, again, if you decide to not use Siphon Souls at all, if you decide Siphon Souls is not for you, this is not the destiny you seek, you can pull that out, pull even more of these points out, go all the way back here, max out your Word of Renewal, or at the very least get it max here. Maybe you want Inquisitor Seal, which I absolutely adore, as you've probably figured out. Go for this, and then you put the rest of the points into Vigor, or maybe you want to put the rest of the points into Deadly Aim. Totally up to you, but you've got quite a lot of options. But you do have, with the Apostate, the very rare opportunity to decrease the resistances to absolutely every damage type you can conceivably deal with the combination, and then some. This gives you some rather interesting diversity in what you can equip, because there is a large quantity of damage types you can boost, and there's a large number of items, of weapons, that you will be able to utilize because you have such a diverse array of damage. But it's a very rare opportunity that you can get your hands on that is a very interesting build to play. It's surprisingly extremely effective. I mean, with all that resistance reduction, you're hitting pretty damn hard. It's very impressive, the amount of damage output you can put here. I said that weird, but you know what I mean. Now, the only other option in a skill-based Apostate is very obviously the classic elemental damage. Now, when I go elemental skill-based apostate, really the only thing that I do, a lot of the time, the only thing I'm pulling out is drain essence, converting the aether damage to cold damage, and running it that way, and then just kind of focusing a little bit on cold damage, kind of hyper-focusing on that, is what I generally tend to do. So, I mean, with the elemental-based skill, the skill-based elemental apostate, you can basically pull anything out of the Inquisitor and have it work. But with the Necromancer, there's not a lot of crossover. You might be thinking, well, Bone Harvest does cold damage and piercing damage, and yes, it does. Yes, it does. And you can use it. I just don't often do so, because a lot of the times I am running this range. This is good if you're melee, if you really feel like putting that many points in, but again, we're coming down to the problem of this is costing us. Well, if you're going to go with an Elemental Inquisitor, you're probably going to go with Aura of Censure, right? And then you're thinking to yourself, okay, what elemental damage types does Necromancer have in terms of skill usage? And I don't really want to auto-attack. Well, you've got the cold damage out of Drain Essence, and you've got Bone Harvest. Now, if you want to go Bone Harvest, and you want to max this out to increase your cold damage and your vitality damage, which is fine, the damage buffs are nice, then you're saving yourself 18 points here, because you're not going to need to go to this point, you're only going to need to go to this point. So that's 18 points out of here. Yay. But you can save an additional 12 points for a total of 30 points saved if you just stick with Drain Essence. So personally, I tend to only pull Drain Essence out of here for a little bit of bonus healing in times of dire need, but I have occasionally built Bone Harvest. I'll usually run Bone Harvest, again, if I'm using two-handed anything, it's a little bit better because this is pulling from your weapon damage, just in general, and then you're of course going to be building you're pulling from your weapon damage here as well. So when I do run a skill-based apostate, I'm usually running a two-handed weapon. Not always. Sometimes I feel like building a single-hand weapon and an offhand. If you're going to use not a two-handed weapon, I would recommend staying away from Bone Harvest, personally. It still will hit hard even without, so don't be afraid to go for that if you're only using the single-hand weapon. I just don't often do that. I'm just not the biggest fan. I find that I can get more out of my runes with a single-hand weapon, because I can utilize artifact handling and do my cold and my fire damage. And generally speaking, I will find that more effective with a single-hand weapon than Bone Spikes, Bone Spears, Bone Harvest. I'm thinking of Diablo. Bone Spears. Bone Spikes. Yes. But if I'm using a single-hand weapon, I personally have found that the runes plus artifact handling do more damage if I'm going to be going in the elemental path. But the skill-based apostate is interesting, especially if you go for the damage variety edition, which, as you can see, has a large amount of resistance reduction for enemies, and is very interesting to improv. With that being said, though, I hope you enjoyed this. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And as always, thank you very much for joining me. And thank you all very much for your support. And have a great 24 hours.